Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our first edition of Cloud Talk on Zoom. It's a new virtual series by Gen.T for blue sky ideas that matter. So it's great to see dozens of you joining us from across Asia. I can see some people from Singapore, from Hong Kong and elsewhere, Indonesia as well, I see. So welcome. So these webinars are actually exclusive to Gen.T honorees as well as a select group of industry leaders. For each session, we invite experts to provide insights on the most pressing topics. So we have a Mandarin version of Cloud Talk that we do on WeChat, but this will be the first English language edition. So for today's panel discussion, we will be talking about the future of alternative protein. But before I go into the topic, let me run through with you today's agenda. All right, so today's session will run about 55 minutes in total. We will start off with a fireside chat with Sonali Figueres, who is the founder, publisher, and editor-in-chief of Green Queen. So Green Queen is a Hong Kong-based impact media platform that recently published its 2020 Asia Alternative Protein Industry Report. So after her talking segment, we will be going into a 5-minute Q&A with her before we move on to our next fireside chat with Julian Ting. So Julian is the Vice President of Level VC, and Level VC is a venture capital fund that specializes in early stage startups in the alternative protein space. So Julian will be talking about the topic from an investor's point of view. Similar to Sonali, we will be proceeding into a Q&A with him as well before we move on to our third and final fireside chat. So our final speaker would be Nidia Zhang, and Nidia is the chair of the Advisory Council at the Good Food Institute Asia Pacific. So GFI, as it's known for short, is a not-for-profit organization that seeks to accelerate the growth of the alternative meat space, basically by working with industry change makers such as scientists, policy makers, as well as funds. All right, and then we will then proceed into a Q&A with her right after that as well, before I will come back into the conversation for some closing notes. Okay, so give me a second. Okay, so just to give you guys a brief understanding about why we chose alternative protein as our topic. So right now, as some of you might know, the rate of the world's meat consumption is fast becoming unsustainable. Just a few key facts for you here. So every 10 seconds, humans kill about 24,000 animals for food. That comes up to about 75 billion a year. So let's take a moment to process that. In the last 50 years, the amount of meat that we have produced has quadrupled. So this means that we have put a huge strain on our land and water resources, as well as greatly contributed to the greenhouse gas emissions. But old habits die hard, right? So organizations and several companies have understand that it's difficult to change people's habits. So what they have done instead is to try and make the transition a little bit easier for meat lovers by producing sustainable alternative proteins that taste and behave like meat. So globally right now, the alternative protein market is worth about $2.2 billion US. So all this and more will be touched on by our speakers in a bit. All right, so right now, let us go through some ground rules before we start the session proper. So as I've mentioned, this is a private event for Gen.T honorees as well as industry experts. This session will be recorded and it will be published with an article that will talk about our key takeaways from the session on our Gen.T website, as well as our social media platforms such as Instagram and Facebook. All attendees will be on view only and on mute mode. So this means that your cameras won't be turned on and all communications will be done via text message. So if you have any questions that you want to ask, you can leave them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have any comments, you can also leave them in the chat box next to it, so you can get to know each other anytime during the session. We will also be launching polls during the session, and they will pop up as you have seen the first poll popped up. You just have to select your option and do participate in them as much as you can. We'll be reading out the results at the end of every fireside chat. And finally, if you're posting about this event on social media, don't forget to tag us at Generation_T_Asia, as well as hashtag Generation_T_Asia. And yes, we're good to go. All right. So let's see. I can see that the first poll results are in. And the question that we asked was, how well do you know the topic of alternative protein? And it seems most of our attendees here know the topic moderately well. So we hope that you'll find our fireside chats with our speakers particularly helpful, as they'll be discussing about the topic from different angles. So without further ado, I'll pass the time over to our moderator, Lee Williamson, who is the editor of Generation.T Asia, to start our first fireside chat with Sonali from Green Queen. Over to you, Lee and Sonali.
Thank you, Xiaowei, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight too. It seems we have an audience who are really clued up on the topic, so we'll have to definitely raise our game tonight. The global human population has more than doubled in the last 50 years, but the amount of meat we produce has more than quadrupled in the same time. In the future, these numbers are going to go up even faster as Asia's economies grow. More people are lifted out of poverty and grow an appetite for Big Macs. Sonali's recently released paper, the Asia Alternative Protein Industry Report, covers this and more in great detail. So it's a pleasure to be joined by Sonali for this conversation. Sonali, are you there? Sonali, if you could turn on your camera and microphone, please. Hi, great to see you. Hi, Sonali, can you hear us?
Hi.
Hi. Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. Tiny technical
Okay.
glitch, but it wouldn't be a webinar without one, I don't think. I haven't seen one where there hasn't been one small bit of lag. Welcome to the Overall Cloud Talk. Let's start with some basic definitions first, if we can.
Sure.
People may be new to the topic.
Yeah.
What falls under the umbrella of alternative protein and plant-based meat?
So alternative protein would be the umbrella term. And technically, if we're being really specific, there are, I would say, 5 different categories under alternative proteins as investors and the market see it. So the first one would be plant-based alternatives to meat and seafood and dairy, right? So that would be something like a Beyond or an Impossible Foods, right? Then you have your cultivated meat, which is also known as cell-based meat or lab-grown meat. And those are basically products that are grown in a lab, or some also known as a cultivator. They're bioreactors where you use the cell of an animal and then you grow it in these lab conditions. So it actually is exactly like meat or seafood or dairy. It's just, it's what we call slaughter-free.
Okay.
The third category would be something that we called in our report whole foods plant-based. So something like mushrooms or jackfruit or maybe soy, sort of tofu-based products, where you're basically using existing vegetables and plants and fruits, and they can mimic the texture and the taste and the cooking style of existing meat, seafood, etc.
Okay, so there's plant-based on one side, it seems, which has a lot of different things under it, a lot of companies. And then there's this kind of lab-grown meat on the other side. It also goes on by the name cultivated, cultured, cell-based. There's lots of different names for it, right?
Right.
This gets a lot of media attention because it sounds quite sci-fi. Is there
right.
any of this lab-grown meat in the market today? If not, when we're likely to see it?
No, there is no commercially available cultivated, cell-based, lab-grown, whichever term. Just to be clear, the Good Foods Institute, which is the largest lobbying NGO worldwide for alternative proteins, they are trying to ensure that the term cultivated is used, which is why most people have gone to it. But originally it was known as lab-grown or cell-based. And currently in the market, there is no commercially available products as such. However, here in Asia, we have 2 very exciting startups that are working in the cultivated space. They're both based in Singapore. One is called Shioke Meats, and they do cell-based lobster, crab, and shrimp. and prawns. And then we have Turtle Tree Labs, which is another really exciting one. And they're doing cell-based dairy, including, and as well as cell-based human breast milk.
Okay.
Yes.
Wasn't expecting you to say that.
Yes.
Okay.
And they are both run by by scientists. And both of them are also co-founded by women, and the founders of those companies have said that they expect to be able to launch something commercially within 2021, so 1 to 2 years.
Yeah.
In the rest of the world, there is talk of 2 to 3 years for cell-based chicken and meat. There's also the problem of regulation. So even if these were commercially available, they need to be regulated and tested and ready for market. And here again, Asia looks like a very bright spot. And as we highlighted in our report, we believe that Singapore and China are markets where we think there'll be quite an open, welcoming reception from regulators for cell-based, for cultivated meats and seafood and other products.
That's super interesting. And honestly, I could go down a rabbit hole with you for about half an hour on this plant-based breast milk, but I'll leave that there and move on and ask you about the explosion recently of plant-based meat and alternative protein. So shout out to you guys. Green Queen has been covering alternative protein for years. It seems like way before it was trendy and everyone was talking about it. And it seems like every time I go on your site, there's an announcement of so-and-so American fast food chain introducing plant-based meat to its menu. Just how has the scene exploded in the last year that you've seen?
Well, that's a great question. I've got some exciting figures for that. So one of the things is, yes, we've been covering, obviously our goal at Green Queen is as an impact media platform is we're trying to cover news and features that are inciting behavioral and social environmental change. And so obviously for us, slaughter-free alternative proteins are important. And I do want to just go back to your first question, because for some people, insect protein are also part of alternative proteins. But in our Asia alternative protein industry report and on our site, we don't cover insect protein for 2 reasons. One, if we're going to look for alternatives, it is our belief at Green Queen that we should find slaughter-free ones, and insects are not slaughter-free. And 2, we don't believe that insects will ever be universally consumed for various social, taste, and cultural reasons. So that's just personal, but there are investors and other people who would define insect protein as under alternative protein. Mm-hmm. So to go back to your question about how the space has exploded, it's one of the reasons that we've been able to have such a voice on this topic based here in Hong Kong is that Hong Kong is one of the most exciting markets to be in if you want to explore plant-based alternatives. We were the first city in the world where Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods and Just Egg launched outside of the US. This is due in no small part to another Gen.T honoree, obviously David Young, and his Green Monday and Green Common kind of mega platform. He is also the creator behind OmniPork, which is the first Asia-based commercially available plant-based meat, and that is a plant-based minced pork alternative. And as of today, OmniPork is now selling and serving in approximately 800 outlets in Hong Kong.
Right.
And Beyond is now in around 500 outlets, and Impossible is in over 200 restaurants. So that's phenomenal kind of capacity, considering these are products that came onto the market within the last 2 years. So we've got about 15,000 restaurants in Hong Kong. So if you're doing the math, it's almost sort of like 0.5% is serving some kind of alternative plant-based meat, which is really incredible. Considering also that we should remember that Hong Kong actually ranks as one of the places in the world where we consume the most meat per capita.
Right. And Asia in general, the hunger for meat is growing. You mentioned that Hong Kong per capita is one of the biggest consumers, but just in general, Asia, as its economy develops and as people get more of a taste for meat, there's going to be more and more meat eaten. So it's kind of makes sense that this region is the center of the issue, both from an innovation standpoint and because this is where a lot of the, the meat eaters in the 21st century are coming from.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us about kind of Asia's increasing hunger for meat?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, currently we're almost 5 billion people in the Asian region, and we're looking to reach about 5 billion by 2050. The numbers are showing that meat and seafood consumption in Asia will rise by 78% by 2050. China and India alone are expected to consume in the roundabout of 360 million tons of protein just by 2025. So that's really not too far away. That's in 5 years. So these are just gigantic numbers, and they're very scary because the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that if everyone in Asia started eating the average US meat heavy diet, we actually would not have the food systems available to supply that diet today.
Right.
And so I think what's really happened in the last couple of years that's quite exciting is that plant-based meats and plant-based alternatives went from being kind of a concern for vegans and animal lovers and people looking for cruelty-free lifestyle choices to being a choice about sustainability and food security.
Absolutely. I mean, I think on your point about China, Asia's raising appetite, China eats more than a quarter of the world's meat, but of course it has almost a population to match, approximately a fifth of the world's population. By comparison, China's per capita meat consumption is still half that of the US. So if this region starts eating meat as much as the US, then we have a serious problem.
Absolutely. It's also worth noting that in Asia, the most consumed meats are chicken and pork, with pork definitely being the highest in China. And then obviously in India, that it would probably be chicken and mutton. But other than that, but obviously these are also very unsustainable choices in those quantities.
So let's move on very, very quickly, because we're running out of time, to the environmental argument for switching to plant-based meat.
Right.
Can you paint a picture of the environmental realities we're facing and how humans eating less meat can directly affect this reality and enact change?
Absolutely. So companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat have been really successful with this kind of communication. And if we just look at how they position themselves, they're saying to you that if you consume a Beyond Meat burger, you're looking at 90% fewer greenhouse gas emissions, 99% less water, and 93% less land than if you were consuming an equivalent beef burger. So what most people may not realize, and it's really important to underline this, is that the number one thing you can do as a consumer in order to reduce your carbon footprint is to reduce meat and dairy consumption. And this is in agreement by hundreds of scientists and researchers worldwide. So this is not just one group or one lobby. This is a consensus academically. And no one is obviously saying that we all need to go vegan, but just reducing the quantity of beef and especially beef, but also all meat and all dairy. And now it's increasingly being shown to include seafood as well. We can really have a huge impact on things like water usage, land usage. So something like 45% of the world's land is used to raise livestock, whether it's using it to grow the food that the livestock eats or to actually have the cattle living on it. So that's just astounding in terms of a statistic.
Yeah, absolutely. I could ask you a number of follow-up questions, but I'm cognizant of the fact that we have an audience and growing audience. It's fantastic to see the numbers ticking up as we're talking, in fact. They are keen to ask you questions as well. So I'm going to stop my video and mute your mic. I'll ask you to stay there, please, and Shai will come in and ask some questions from our
Absolutely
as well. Thanks. Thank you, Sonali.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Sonali. So let me see what questions we have from the Q&A. So for Sonali, we do have a question that's quite interesting from Renat Siu, who is, I believe, a Malaysia honoree. He wants to know, how receptive is the halal market towards cultivated meat and lab-grown human breast milk? Are you able to answer that for us?
it would not be right for me to answer that because this, as we covered earlier, the products are not commercially available. What we do know is that there is some preliminary research showing that actually Indian and Chinese consumers, and there's a study, I can share the details later. It's a small study, so I don't want to overstate it, but there is this study that shows that Chinese and Indian consumers are more open to cultivated lab-grown meat than their American counterparts, and that they are not as bothered by the lab aspect of it. But in terms of halal, the animal would not actually be being slaughtered. So I think it would be pretty straightforward to get some kind of halal certification. On the plant-based side, products like Omni Meat and beyond actually have been certified halal. Okay. So they're ready, and the reception in Malaysia and it has been very strong from what I understand from my friends at Green Common.
Right. Okay, I hope that answers your questions, Renat. So maybe we have time for just one last question. So we have a question from Nick Wilson. What's the biggest factor stopping people from going fully plant-based with their diet? Why do you think that is the case?
Honestly, I would have to say that the biggest factor is just lack of awareness about the footprint of their diet, followed closely by a misconception that it is more expensive or more difficult. So I think that's why it's incumbent upon brands and innovators and entrepreneurs and media like myself to make sure that people know that these options are delicious, they're affordable, they're accessible. You can now buy, Omni Pork ready meals for 38 Hong Kong dollars. That's very affordable. That's about, just under $4 US. That's not a huge expense. So things are changing, but I think overall people don't know that their diet is linked to the climate crisis as much as it is.
Right. So it's all about awareness. It's all about raising awareness.
So panels like this are extremely important, and more discussions, more awareness, more profiling of the issues, like your awesome newsletter and about it. And we really need to get the topics more mainstream.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sonali, for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. So maybe we can get you to switch off your video as we move on to our next fireside chat with Julian.
Sure.
So, but before I do that, I would like to read out our second poll result. So our second poll result is related to what Julian will be talking about. So we asked you, have you invested in an alternative protein startup before? And majority, not surprising, have said no. So we have 61% saying no of that. So hopefully Julian will be able to share some insights as to why the alternative protein space is so attractive to invest in. So I'll pass it over to Julian and Lee again. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiaowei. It's great to see that we have a number of potential investors that are keen to get Julian's perspective. Julian, it is great to get your perspective this evening, because everyone is talking about investing in plant-based meat right now, especially after a couple of very recent success stories. Beyond Meat's shares soared 163% on its first day of trading when it went when it went public in May 2019. If you'd invested $1,000 in Beyond Meat at IPO 11 months ago, it would be worth a total of $4,500 today. That's a return of 345%. I think those are numbers that everyone can get behind, even someone that's not a numbers guy like me. I appreciate how massive that jump is. The list of high-profile investors in this industry is massive. Hong Kong tycoon Li Ka-shing has backed Beyond Meat. Singapore's very successful sovereign wealth fund, Temasek, has invested in Impossible Foods. And Bill Gates has invested in both. In fact, he's hedging his bets. What do they know that I don't?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Before I answer that, I'll just quickly give a brief introduction of Lever VC. So Lever VC, we're an early stage venture capital firm that's focused squarely on the alternative protein space globally. We're led by our managing partner, Nick Cooney, who was previously the co-founder of the Good Food Institute, and also Lawrence Chu, who's another partner at the firm. And I believe Lawrence, Gen.T honoree.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, Lee, I think what all investors are seeing, we're not unique in our perspective. Is one, you have this macro backdrop that Sonali talked about. You have this unsustainable demand trajectory for conventional proteins that the traditional animal agriculture complex just can't handle. On the other hand, you also have this big shift in consumer preferences. We believe that this is a secular shift. So increasingly, we've seen the emergence of the plant-based diet. I think a lot of people are identifying with being a flexitarian nowadays.
Right.
And what's encouraging to see is that this particular phenomenon has been quite strong in the younger demographics, so the millennials and Gen Z in particular.
Yeah. So you're an investor. Can you give me some numbers to back that up? I'm sure you have plenty in your pocket. What is the size of the alternative protein market right now, and what are the future projections?
Yeah. So in terms of the overall penetration rate, we sit at just about 0.5%. So in the US, the total meat industry is worth $200 billion. So, and that's, I think, as of last year. So that was a 2018 number. So half of that is about $1 billion. Globally, we're just over $1 trillion in terms of overall meat. I think it's 1.2. So 0.5% of that is, still less than 10 billion.
Right.
But just to kind of contextualize that 0.5% penetration number, just over a decade ago, plant-based milks as a percentage of total fluid milk sales sat at just under 1%. Today, that same number is at 13%. So that just gives you a sense of how quickly adoption can move.
Absolutely. And there is so much innovation in this space as well. I think people are really cottoning on to this, these people who are kind of willing to adapt their diets and these trends that are happening very, very quickly. And everybody knows about Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat. And in Asia, some companies like Omnipork that Sonali mentioned and Gen.T in China are starting to gain some traction. But Sonali's fantastic report records a total of about 22 alternative protein startups in Asia right now. Which ones has Lever VC invested in, and which ones have your attention?
So we track all the companies in the space, in Asia in particular. So we have a database of just under 1,000 companies, 950 globally. In Asia, we track China very closely. We've made 3 investments in the Asian region. So Turtle Tree Investments, Turtle Tree Labs, the company that makes the human breast milk as well as bovine milk through cellular agriculture. We led their seed round. We've also invested in a Hong Kong-based company called Avat Meats. So Avat is in the business of producing clean marine protein. So the first product was a cell-based fish maw, and they had a public tasting a few months ago. Yeah. And the last company we invested in is called Marvelous Foods. So they make plant-based yogurt in China.
So not long ago, Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat were niche startups, right? And just a few later, they are major American food manufacturers. A huge part of this surge has been fueled, of course, by fundraising. Last year, Impossible closed a $300 million Series E round on a valuation of about $2 billion. Contrastingly, Asia's seen very little investment in this space with, I believe, at this point, no Series A investments for an alternative protein startup. Most are still at the pre-seed or the seed funding stage. How quickly do you see that changing? Is the market starting to heat up locally?
Yeah, I think you'll find that that's going to change pretty quickly. So, we made seed investments. The earliest checks went out about 6 to 8 months ago. So those companies would be coming to market to raise an A round in the next 6 months. So I'd say you'll see the first few A rounds come about this year. Where where we are now relative to the North American and Western European markets is a function of, I guess, innovation. So the hotbed of innovation is traditionally in the Silicon Valley, right? So a lot of companies on the West Coast. In Western Europe, you've also seen a much earlier adoption, and Asia we lag a bit. As we see more companies like Tree get strong fundraising, they get more media. I think that virtuous cycle of capital coming in, attracting talent, and then talent creating better products, and better products leads to more consumer interest, which leads to more capital coming into that ecosystem again. That flywheel starts to turn, but we're still in admittedly the early innings. There are about 30 to 40 companies on our radar in the region.
When you're looking at alternative protein startups to invest in, what metrics are you analyzing? Is it similar to how you'd analyze any other startup with investment potential, or is there something particular to this market?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that we look at all these investments as any investor would. So we try and handicap ultimately risk versus reward. So at its most basic level, we're looking at market risk. Is the market size big enough? Are people going to buy this? We're looking at execution risk. Is the team strong? Are these founders reliable? We're looking at product risk as well. I'd say it breaks down into two buckets. The first is the more plant-based meat and dairy companies, which are traditional consumer packaged goods companies. Those are a bit more straightforward. What you're looking for is early, consumer traction.
Sure.
What's a bit trickier are the companies in the cell-based space,
right?
Because those obviously require a much deeper understanding of the science behind that. So as much as we're a specialist fund, we rely on our expert bench. So we have PhDs that specialize in cellular agriculture, and they help lead our diligence on that side of things.
Yeah. Speaking of the cell-based, or I think cultivated analysis that she wants us to use, that, as you say, is its own case in that it's facing potential regulatory impediments because it is a brand new product. People think of it as this kind of sci-fi thing, and it hasn't been done before. It seems that a lack of regulation, because it's brand new, rather than constrictive regulation, is the problem when it comes to this cultivated meat. The US startup Just is one of several startups working on this cultivated meat, which regenerates animal meat using a single cell as its source. The company's CEO, Josh Tetrick, said that their product is pretty much ready to be rolled out, but uncertainty around the legality of the product due to, quote, an absence of regulation is what's delaying the launch. Is this kind of regulatory uncertainty something that you think is likely to happen in Asia as well?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. I hesitate to use the term impediment because that kind of alludes to the notion that there's a big industry lobby that's stymieing development of regulatory frameworks. I mean, there's certainly a very powerful meat and dairy lobby, but what we've seen in the U.S. is both the USDA and the FDA are coming together to jointly regulate the space, the cultivated meat and dairy space. So we know that there's every intention to give investors and companies regulatory certainty. There's already that kind of signal to the market. I don't think that regulations are currently the bottleneck for commercialization of all cultivated meat and dairy products. Right now, the truth is that the cost of production is so high that you couldn't sell it for break even in the market. We're probably another 2 or 3 years away from commercialization. In Asia, what we've seen is that regulators and governments have been pretty open-minded, quite willing to play ball. So, for example, our company, Tree Labs, right now, so they're in the business of producing milk from cells, essentially in a lab, in a laboratory setting. Although there doesn't yet exist any sort of regulations around, what they do, they've been working with the Singapore Food Agency, keeping them posted of their activities. The Singapore Food Agency has been reaching out to them, so every month they'll touch base and they'll talk about like what the company is doing and what they should look out for in terms of potential regulatory pitfalls. So it's a kind of like an informal sandbox, so to speak.
Yeah.
In China, again, the same thing. Nick, our managing partner, has been in closed door sessions with some government representatives, and they're very curious about the space. They've already publicly made the statement that they want to see consumption of animal protein come down by 50%. And it's China, central command economy. When they say something like that publicly, they typically follow through.
Yeah, it really does seem like the next 2 to 3 years, like you say, is where we're really going to see some regulation come into place so that these startups have a framework to follow and they can start to bring their products to market. Julian, this has been super interesting. I could go on for another 10, for all night, honestly, but I am going to hand over to Xiaowei. Please keep your video and mic on, and Xiaowei will ask a couple of questions from our attendees.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Thanks, Lee.
Hi, sorry about that. It was a bit laggy on my side. Yeah, so some Q&A that we have, some interesting questions. So we have one from a Singapore honoree, Dean Ho. He wants to find out, so from Julian, from your portfolio of startups that you guys have invested in, are there any startups that are looking at exploring the role of AI, artificial intelligence, to accelerate the production or maybe to optimize the desired properties of alternative proteins?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not something that's come up in our conversations with our portfolio companies. To my knowledge, none of them have started to employ these technologies yet, but I do know that there are companies outside of our portfolio that utilize AI to screen for ingredients that would make a lot of sense for in alternative protein applications. But yeah, I mean, if you guys know of a good off-the-shelf solution that our portfolio companies could use to optimize their workflows, yeah, definitely keen to look into that.
So would you say that such companies that are utilizing AI, are they common in Asia? Have you seen, not necessarily from the portfolio that you're looking at, but outside beyond your portfolio? Is it a common thing?
I don't know, not to my knowledge, it's not, but yeah, I really don't have a good, to my knowledge, no, it's not that common. Yeah, I've met 1 or 2 companies who are AI startups that want to use their technology in, I guess, ingredient discovery applications. But in terms of companies that are engineered with that sort of AI platform underpinning the business, I haven't seen that.
Okay, maybe one final question we have. Let's see, from Samantha Top. So what are 3 things that you look out for when you're investing in an alternative protein startup? Your top 3 things that you look out for.
Yeah, so number 1 is always going to be founder. We want really strong founders, ideally with a track record of success. Ideally they've built a business successfully before. But more importantly is, I guess, their passion and intellectual honesty, I'd say. The second thing that we tend to look out for is, the market size. So it has to be, we need to have line of sight to, a path to essentially a 10x. So the opportunity set has to be big enough for us. And I'd say, lastly, particularly for the consumer packaged goods types of companies, so on the plant-based side of things instead of the cultivated meat and dairy companies, we like to see commercial traction. So although we come in very early, we come in pre-seed all the way through Series A. At the very least, we want to see, if it's possible, early product market fit.
Okay, thank you very much for that. All right, okay, thank you very much for your time, Julian. We'll move on to our next fireside chat now with Nidia. Thank you, Julian.
Thanks, Xiaowei.
All right. Hi, Nidia.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, okay. So just before we proceed into a fireside chat with you, let me just read out the poll results for our third poll, which is, so we asked the question, how likely are you to get into the alternative protein diet? And most people have said quite likely. A lot of people have actually tried a plant-based meal every once in a while. So that's interesting. So maybe I can pass it on to you and Lee to discuss a little bit more about what's so attractive about going into plant-based.
Thank you, Xiaowei. And it is great to hear that the majority of you are open to plant-based diets. And I hope that's something that is reflected across society as a whole, because the World Economic Forum's white paper on the future of alternative protein says that meeting the protein needs of a projected global population of 10 billion people by 2050 in a sustainable manner will be a significant challenge, but it can be done, quote unquote. The report says that, quote again, transformation of the food system is essential to meet the Paris Agreement climate change targets. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Nidia this evening because non-profit organization, the Good Food Institute, works with scientists, investors, and entrepreneurs to help make this global change a reality. So Nidia, welcome. Can you tell us a bit more about GFI? What's your mission and how are you achieving it?
Hi. Very glad to be here to share GFI and our mission and vision with all of you. So for GFI, we are an international non-for-profit, and we are here to harness the power of food innovation and market in order to accelerate the development of plant-based cultivated meat, eggs, and dairy, and also other important protein sources, for example, like seafood. Our mission is to create a sustainable, healthy, and just global food system. So for GFI, we are 4 years old and have 5 international affiliations around the globe and more than 100 staff internationally as well. So, sorry, please go ahead.
No, so I was going to ask, so really all of which means that you have a uniquely holistic viewpoint as you work with stakeholders from across industries and backgrounds. So what do you think the future holds for plant-based meat in Asia in particular?
I think when it comes to Asia Pacific, it needs to be bearing in mind that we are here experiencing a very different cultural context, dietary habits, and also governmental environment between all different countries. So for GFI APAC, we cover all the countries except for India and New Zealand and Australia. So I would say when it comes to progression and development of plant-based meat per se, I would say, for example, Hong Kong and Singapore are definitely at the frontier of adapting and embracing plant-based products. And then for countries like China, Southeast Asia, and we are taking different strategies and also measurement in order to tackle, let's say, from knowledge base first, and then later on introduce more plant-based startups into their markets, and then to see how the market's audience and also policymakers react to products like that.
Sure. So Impossible Foods founder and CEO Pat Brown is one of the kind of rock stars of this industry. He said that people don't like meat because it comes from the cadaver of an animal. They like it despite the fact that it comes from the cadaver of an animal. And therefore, if companies like his can get to the point where meat alternatives taste good, behave similarly in the kitchen, and are at the same price point or potentially even cheaper than meat, then it's completely game over for the meat industry. Do you share this optimism?
I think my 2 cents of view is that I see plant-based meat and traditional meat industry not mutually exclusive. I do think, in the future that we are looking more of a coexisting dynamic. Let's put into Asian context. I think the demand for meat especially in developing countries, are still going strong. And then that has a lot to do with cultural context. And then as meat still holds a kind of a more premium in the hierarchy about people's protein choices. And then again, I think there will be a shift of mindset when it comes to that, but it's gonna take years, which means that I think the demand for meat will still be there. But it doesn't mean that the plant-based product will not be embraced. And then the other thing I want to state, which is that a lot of work that we do in GFI is that we work with some of the biggest meat companies in the world, for example, Tyson. And then as some of you might know, that Tyson is actually one of the biggest investors in Beyond Meat. And then what we see is that it's important to make traditional industry leaders and companies to see that the potential of alternative protein, so they can, from their side, to capitalize on opportunities of alternative protein and plant-based meat. Right. So we can have a more coherent and inclusive dynamic in this entire food ecosystem.
Right. As Julian touched upon, food lobbies are so insanely powerful, particularly in the West. If they're not on board, they're doing everything they can to impede you. So it's better to work closely together, I imagine. I want to move on to current events. The COVID-19 outbreak, which is believed to have transmitted from animals to humans in a Wuhan wet market, is likely to quicken the acceptance of plant-based protein, according to some analysts, as consumers will become when all of this is in the rearview mirror, consumers will become increasingly wary of meat. What impact do you think this pandemic will have on the issue of food security and the future of alternative protein?
I think first I want to express that we are at a very strange point of history in human history, and then I think the pandemic has created a tremendous challenging situation for not just alternative protein industry, but in industry in general. I think there are good and bad, and I think I will start with bad. I think definitely it makes consumers right now start to make their choices, they are probably will lean towards that products that have lower price point, because right now everybody is under a lot of, I would imagine everybody's under a lot of financial pressure, and consider plant-based products. Some of plant-based products I still holds a slightly higher price point in amount of other products. So this might affect consumer behaviors, and also this might have a, less, for investors, there might be less investment, I would say, capital available towards early stage startups.
And all industries, right? Not specific to
exactly. And also, I guess, just in general, fear and uncertainty is definitely adding pressure to our industries. Although I think right now I'm moving to the good parts. I think the biggest one and the takeaway for consumers and also the entire human population is the question that will zoonotic outbreaks makes mainstream consumers to rethink eating animal meat. And with that bearing in mind, I do see that there is a realization, for example, the shelf life of plant-based products, that plant-based product does have a longer shelf life compared to other meat products, and also it has a better real-time responsiveness to the demand of animal products, because you need to raise an animal, slaughter them, and then serve it to your place. And then that lifespan of meat production doesn't change, but for plant-based products is mostly dry ingredients. So I think, in order to satisfy and then to respond quickly to, let's say, a sudden change of global demand, plant-based sometimes can have a more advantage. One thing I do want to share, a interesting stat just came in this morning. The sales of plant-based product had grown dramatically in March in the States alongside with meat products. And that number is 255% compared to last year.
Why do you think that is? Why are these numbers growing? When people are panic buying for the pandemic? I mean, as you say, they have a longer shelf life. Is it just that alternative proteins are good for a prep kit? Is that why the numbers have gone up?
I think it's a combination of both. I think first that people are people panicked and people want to store up food, any kind, as much as possible. And that's why the plant-based product grow alongside with meat products. And the second is that I think people start to realize that as consumers, their dietary choices and also, of course, zoonotic outbreak has impacted their lives, which means when they start to make choices, they will think before they act. And the last point probably is, you know, the long preservation time and the longer shelf life, especially for plant-based dairy alternatives that definitely have a strong stand in this case.
Yeah, in these strange times, we could all do with longer lead times between our supermarket trips. So I'm sure that longer shelf life comes into play as well. I do want to touch upon the health and diet side as well. Obviously, these products have a huge benefit for the environment, as we've touched upon. And, you know, it's pretty much undeniable that eating less meat and more plants is better for our health. However, you know, a Beyond Burger or an Impossible Burger, a Gen Meat dumpling, often they have as much calories and saturated fat, certainly the Beyond Burger and Impossible Burger do, have as much calories and saturated fat as a regular beef patty, and in some cases, 5 times as much sodium. So these aren't health foods. How do you as the GFI communicate that? Obviously, you want people to eat less meat, you want people to turn to these, but you don't want people to be under the impression that these are super healthy alternatives.
We actually got this question a lot, and I think there are a couple ways to understand it. I think first point I want to state is that I think people often overlooked that actually there are a lot of hidden ingredients in meat products. For example, animal feeds, antibiotics, hormones that were, you know, injected into the animal body, and also the potential bacterial contamination that happened during the logistic kind of process. And then those were not, those kind of information would not show on the label when you purchase a piece of meat. So I think, you know, that this, you know, this should be, you know, stated more. And then the second is that I think health is a very kind of, is a relative term towards different individuals. And then I think, you know, my bottom line is a healthy diet. A healthy diet means a balanced diet. And then also, for example, that you maybe eating Impossible Burger or Beyond Meat 3-4 times or, you know, a day is probably not the healthiest choice you can make. But if you taking alternative protein, alternative meat products into, let's say, 20 or 30% of your daily consumption alongside with fresh produce, and then that might better serve, you know, if you the health goal. And then second is that, you know, we are aware that there is, you know, a larger kind of sodium factor and then maybe concentrated fat into plant-based products. But again, you know, it does have 0 cholesterol compared to, let's say, you know, 4-ounce Beyond Burger versus 4-ounce grass-fed beef. So I guess, you know, that should also be taken into account into which aspect of your health that, you know, you want to pay more attention to. And I think last but not least is that meat is not a optimized immutable source. It's not a better protein source. Every component of meat you can be seeked inside of plants. And then, but the truth is, for meats, for animal meats, there are less room to, let's say, optimize, but it's a different story on alternative protein side. The quality, taste, price, and convenience are extremely different for all the plant-based product. And then I believe in the future, you know, with the help of science, technology, R&D power, that we can definitely make more nutritious and then cheaper price products that are available to the majority of the population.
Fantastic. And on that note, I'm going to say I love your wallpaper. And thank you very much for your time this evening. I'm going to hand over to Xiaowei for a final Q&A with you and to wrap up. So with that, I'll say thank you to you, Nydia, and thank you to everybody that's joined us tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nydia. Thank you, Lee. So moving on to the Q&A. So we have been talking about how healthy alternative proteins are with you. But we have a question from Aditya Nandiwardhana. I hope I didn't butcher your name. I'm very sorry if I did. So she asked, in terms of environmental impact, how green would alternative protein production be compared to other alternative means of producing food, such as permaculture? Maybe Nidia, you can answer that.
I think when it comes to alternative protein, as it was mentioned previously before, we do have many different categories. I think, let's say we have plant-based cultivated meat, eggs and dairy, and also fermentation plays another big part, in the alternative protein family. So I think, on the environmental side of things, that plant-based product, like I would say, even with, for example, with the most efficient protein, chicken, that is still 9 calories in and 1 calories out. And then that is not, that we have not factored all the land use, water use, feeds, animal feeds that was go before, that was, and also logistic, all the kind of resources that has been put before that was put into our mouths. And then so I definitely see that there is a tremendous benefit towards eliminating and then relieving environmental burden, in this regard. And then as for cultivated meat, once it was commercialized, commercially available, and we are looking at 1/10, probably of the land use, and then water use, and then with all the resources that's being used coming after that.
Okay, thank you very much. Guess one final question for you would be, so specifically to Asia, what do you think is the biggest challenge that the GFI faces when it comes to trying to raise awareness or trying to change people to go into more plant-based or cultivated meat diets?
Well, I think for GFI, our focus, has been, let's say, we publish high quality industry reports. We work very closely with, corporations, and then we try to cultivate the startup and investor community. And we also want to work with policymakers to change the outlook of alternative protein. So I think that, and then we are tackled that as the first generation of, GFI in Asia Pacific. I think right now, we want more of everything, right? We want more companies, and we want more entrepreneurs, and then we want more R&D power to be focusing on alternative protein. And then, so I think I would say they are all good challenges. And so far we want to emphasize, one is probably our R&D talent. We really want more researchers, students, professors from universities across Asia Pacific region to take interest and then start your research on alternative protein, and then see us, as a hub and as a place that you want to get support from, get in contact, and then to help, and also for us to be helpful for you. And I also, in here, want to do a call for action. As for GFI APAC, we're doing our first media launch end of April, so stay tuned to our website and our other media channel. And we have a China partner called GFIC who just recently launched their website, also WeChat channel, and their focus is on scientific research and also the alternative landscape in China. So if you are interested in that, please also keep an eye and stay tuned, with all the activities that we will be doing soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nidia. Thanks for your time. So I guess just to close up the conversation, give me a second. Okay, so I guess thank you everyone for joining us today, and also all our speakers for taking the time to speak with us, to share some interesting insights. We hope you enjoyed, or rather everyone, we hope you enjoyed the webinar, the first webinar that we're holding on Zoom. So similar to our Mandarin version of Cloud Talk, which is held on WeChat, as I mentioned, we hold our English language edition every 2 weeks. So you can join us in 2 weeks' time again. So it seems, according to our last poll results that we asked, what would you like to hear next for our Cloud Talk topic? It seems the winner, that we have 2 winners actually. So the first one would be gender gap, the gender pay gap. And we also have how to lead a remote team next. So, okay, we've heard you. Let us look into it and we will present you with the next webinar. So just a plug here, for more content around topics such as alternative protein, don't forget to visit the Gen.T website at Gen.T.Asia. You can also follow us on Instagram at GenerationT_Asia, or you can subscribe to our deep dive newsletter where we talk about this kind of topics, pressing topics in detail. So thank you everyone again. Please stay safe and have a good evening. See you.